April 18, 1945, the Ruhr pocket, Western Germany. Over 500,000 battle-hardened soldiers who had survived everything from Stalingrad to Normandy made a choice that would have seemed impossible just months before. They surrendered en masse to American forces instead of continuing to fight or retreating to German lines. The Americans hadn't just brought superior firepower. They had unleashed something far more devastating. A systematic approach to warfare that made resistance not just futile, but completely irrational. Let's go back to April 4th, 1945. 6 in the morning, on the east bank of the Rhine River in the Lippstadt sector, the encirclement was complete. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, stood in his makeshift headquarters, staring at maps that told a story his military mind could barely comprehend. In just 12 days, American armored spearheads had accomplished what German military doctrine said was operationally impossible: the complete encirclement of an entire army group. 325,000 combat troops, plus support units, supply personnel, and stragglers brought the total to over 430,000 men trapped in a pocket, roughly 50 miles wide. But the raw numbers weren't what made this moment unprecedented in military history. German forces had been surrounded before at Stalingrad, at Falaise, at countless smaller battles across the eastern and western fronts. What made the Ruhr pocket different was what happened next, or rather what didn't happen. There would be no desperate breakout attempts, no suicidal last stands, no fanatical resistance to the last bullet. Instead, over the next 2 weeks, the largest mass surrender in Western Front history would unfold, revealing something that terrified the German high command more than any weapon. Their soldiers had stopped believing in resistance. The Americans called their approach vertical envelopment, but that sterile military term masked a revolution in combined arms warfare that had been perfected over 3 years of combat, from North Africa to the Rhine. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, had developed a system of warfare that didn't just defeat German positions. It made defending them psychologically impossible. The German soldiers trapped in the Ruhr had been told for years that American forces were soft, inexperienced, reliant on material superiority rather than fighting skill. They had been assured that German tactical excellence and superior willpower would overcome American industrial might. Army Group B contained veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Kursk and Kiev, soldiers who knew how to fight in encirclements and had broken out before. Yet within days of the pocket's formation, entire divisions were surrendering without firing a shot. By April 18th, when Model dissolved Army Group B and released his men from their oath, over 317,000 had already laid down their arms. By the time the pocket was completely cleared on April 21st, American forces had processed 325,000 prisoners, with estimates suggesting total captures exceeded 500,000 when counting attached Luftwaffe, SS, and paramilitary units throughout the industrial Ruhr region. What the Germans encountered wasn't a conventional military force, it was an integrated system of destruction that operated on principles they had never faced, not from the Soviets, not from the British, not in any previous campaign. The Americans had developed something that military historians would later recognize as a fundamental evolution in warfare: the ability to make continued resistance not just difficult or costly, but functionally meaningless. The weapon wasn't a single piece of technology, it was the seamless integration of air power, armor, artillery, logistics, and psychological operations into a machine that ground down not just German combat capability, but German will to fight. Every element reinforced the others, creating a cascade effect that made each hour of resistance more futile than the last. In his final message before dissolving Army Group B, Model wrote, "The Americans do not fight battles. They stage industrial operations. Our men face not an army but a system. Courage means nothing when the enemy can predict your every move, answer your every action, and make your position untenable before you even occupy it." 3 weeks later, Model walked into the woods near Duisburg and shot himself. He left no note, but his aide recorded his final words: "A field marshal does not surrender, and I cannot ask my men to do what I cannot." But his men had already made their choice, not because they were cowards, but because they had recognized a truth that their commanders refused to accept. The Americans had created a form of warfare where traditional military virtues like courage, tactical skill, and determination became irrelevant. You couldn't outfight a system that had already calculated every possible response. You couldn't outmaneuver forces that controlled every approach. You couldn't outlast an enemy whose supply lines stretched back to an untouched industrial heartland an ocean away. The story of the Ruhr pocket isn't about a battle. It's about the moment when industrial age warfare reached its logical conclusion, when one side's systematic approach made the other side's continued resistance not just impossible, but pointless. 500,000 German soldiers didn't surrender because they were defeated in combat. They surrendered because they had been made obsolete. The German military doctrine that failed so catastrophically in April 1945 had been born from success. For 5 years, the Wehrmacht had conquered a continent using principles that had proven devastatingly effective: speed, concentration of force, tactical flexibility, and the superior training of individual soldiers and small unit commanders. The concept was Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics, where commanders at every level understood the overall objective and had the authority to achieve it through their own initiative. A German lieutenant could react to battlefield conditions faster than an American colonel could, receive orders from division headquarters. This decentralized command structure had enabled German forces to consistently outmaneuver more numerous opponents. From Poland in 1939 to France in 1940, from the Balkans to the initial campaigns in Russia, this system had worked brilliantly. German soldiers were extensively trained, with even basic infantry receiving education that emphasized independent thinking and tactical awareness. A German squad leader had more authority and training than many Allied platoon commanders. This created a military culture where small groups of men could achieve disproportionate results through superior skill and initiative. By 1943, despite mounting losses and strategic setbacks, German tactical doctrine still produced impressive results. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, relatively small German forces inflicted humiliating defeats on American units in their first major engagement. The Germans had demonstrated that even when outnumbered and outgunned, superior tactics and veteran leadership could overcome material disadvantages. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in North Africa, was forced to restructure American training and doctrine after Kasserine. The lessons were painful but clear. American forces needed fundamental changes in how they approached combat. Raw courage and industrial output weren't enough against an enemy who could consistently outthink and outmaneuver them at the tactical level. But the Germans had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that warfare would continue to be decided by these tactical engagements, that battles would be won by better trained soldiers making better decisions in individual firefights. They believed that as long as German tactical excellence remained superior, they could offset American material advantages. What they failed to understand was that the Americans weren't trying to win tactical engagements. They were building a system that would make tactical excellence irrelevant. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States military underwent a transformation that had no parallel in military history. It wasn't about creating better individual soldiers, though American training did improve significantly. It was about creating an integrated system where individual tactical decisions mattered less than systematic operational superiority. The scale of American logistical preparation was something the German military couldn't conceptualize. By early 1945, American forces in Western Europe were supported by a supply network that delivered 26,000 tons of supplies daily. Every American division crossing the Rhine had artillery support that could deliver more tonnage in an hour than an entire German corps could fire in a day. But logistics alone don't explain the psychological collapse. The Soviets had enormous material superiority on the Eastern Front, yet German forces continued fighting with desperate determination, even in hopeless situations. At Budapest, German and Hungarian forces held out for 50 days in a siege that ended in near-total annihilation. At Breslau, the garrison fought for 82 days, continuing resistance even after Hitler's death. Against the Americans, that same determination evaporated. The difference wasn't firepower, it was predictability and inevitability. American doctrine had evolved into something the Germans called Materialschlacht, material battle, but that term didn't capture what made it psychologically devastating. The Americans had developed a systematic approach, where every German action triggered a predetermined, overwhelming response. Artillery observers called in fire missions within minutes. Air support appeared within an hour. Tank columns maneuvered to cut off withdrawal routes before German commanders even realized their positions were compromised. It wasn't that Americans predicted German moves through intelligence or brilliant generalship. They simply had enough resources to prepare for every possibility simultaneously. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, operations chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, wrote in his diary in March 1945, "Against the Americans, our tactical doctrine has become a prison. Every principle that served us well against the Poles, French, and even Soviets now works against us. Our flexibility means nothing when the enemy has prepared responses to every option. Our initiative is meaningless when every action triggers overwhelming retaliation. We are fighting an opponent who doesn't need to outthink us. They've made thinking irrelevant." This was the context that Army Group B entered when American forces crossed the Rhine. They brought tactical excellence, veteran leadership, and determination to a fight where none of those qualities mattered anymore. They were prepared for a battle. What they encountered was an industrial process designed to make battle impossible. The German defensive preparations in the Ruhr represented the culmination of 5 years of hard-won tactical knowledge. Army Group B wasn't a collection of green recruits or demoralized garrison troops. It contained the 116th Panzer Division, veterans of the Normandy campaign, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, which had fought through Italy and France, the 338th Infantry Division, survivors of the Eastern Front. These weren't men who broke easily. General Günther Blumentritt, commanding 1st Parachute Army within the pocket, had personally overseen defensive preparations throughout January and February 1945. His planning documents, captured after the surrender, revealed meticulous attention to lessons learned from 3 years of retreat. Every position had been sited with interlocking fields of fire. Every bridge had demolition charges. Every crossroad had been pre-registered for artillery. Every likely American approach had prepared defensive positions. The Ruhr industrial region itself provided natural advantages. The area contained over 4,000 factories, countless mine shafts, and urban areas perfect for defensive warfare. The terrain was broken by rivers, canals, and industrial complexes that channeled any attacking force into predictable routes. German engineers had spent months preparing positions that would turn each factory, each urban block, each river crossing into a killing ground. Intelligence assessments captured from German divisional headquarters showed they understood American capabilities. They knew about American artillery superiority. Their doctrine called for immediate dispersal when American forward observers were spotted. They knew about American air power. They planned operations during bad weather and prepared covered positions. They knew about American armor tactics. They prepared anti-tank positions in depth with carefully planned withdrawal routes. What made German commanders confident wasn't ignorance of American strength. It was faith in proven defensive doctrine. The Manual for Positional Defense, refined through years of combat, dictated that a properly prepared defensive position held by determined troops could exact casualties of 3 to 5 attackers for every defender lost. The mathematics seemed simple. Even if Americans had 3-to-1 superiority, attacking into prepared defenses should produce unsustainable casualties. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding 53rd Corps, had survived North Africa, Normandy, and the Ardennes offensive. His after-action reports consistently emphasized the same principle. American forces would attack until casualties became politically unacceptable, then pause to reorganize. The German goal wasn't to win, it was to make victory too expensive. Every day of resistance bought time for wonder weapons, for peace negotiations, for some miracle that would stave off total defeat. The pocket's defenders had ammunition stockpiled for weeks of combat. Food supplies had been consolidated from the surrounding region. Medical facilities had been established in the safest rear areas. Communications networks linked every major position. On paper, Army Group B had everything needed for extended resistance. Colonel Wilhelm Wiebig, operations officer for the 15th Army, wrote in his journal on April 3rd, the day before encirclement, "The Americans will find the Ruhr a far different battle than their race across France. Here we fight from prepared positions with our backs to our homeland. Here their speed means nothing. They must come to us, and we will make them pay in blood for every kilometer. We have studied their methods. We know their patterns. We are ready." But every assumption in German planning contained a fatal flaw. They had prepared for a battle. They had calculated for combat where tactical decisions mattered, where terrain provided advantage, where determination and skill could offset material inferiority. They had built a fortress designed to withstand siege warfare, as understood by military traditions stretching back centuries. What they couldn't prepare for was an opponent who had evolved beyond battle entirely. The Americans hadn't come to fight for the Ruhr. They had come to process it. And the difference between those two concepts, fighting versus processing, would become clear within hours of the encirclement's completion. And once German soldiers understood that difference, their carefully prepared defenses would become not fortresses, but prisons. What the Americans deployed against the Ruhr pocket wasn't a secret weapon or revolutionary technology. It was something far more devastating: systematic operational integration, refined into a doctrine that military historians would later call synchronized warfare. The innovation wasn't in any single element. It was in how every element functioned, as parts of a single mechanism. The concept had been developed by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group staff during the winter of 1944. Operations Officer Brigadier General Truman Thorson had created what he called the Red Ball system, a coordinated methodology where intelligence, artillery, air power, armor, and logistics operated on synchronized timelines that made German tactical responses predictable and therefore exploitable. April 5, 1945, 8:30 in the morning, the first full day of the encirclement. The system activated. American P-38 Lightning reconnaissance aircraft began flying a grid pattern over the entire pocket at precisely timed intervals. Every camera pass was numbered and catalogued. Photo interpreters at NIEX Tactical Air Command headquarters received developed film within 2 hours of each mission. They weren't looking for tanks or troop concentrations. They were mapping every German position, every movement, every supply dump, creating a living picture of the entire defensive network. By 2 in the afternoon, the first pattern had emerged. German units were repositioning to defend the most obvious American approach routes, exactly as doctrine dictated. American intelligence officers marked these positions on master maps and calculated something the Germans couldn't anticipate: the timing of German movements. At 4 o'clock, American artillery began firing on roads and intersections, not where German troops were, but where they would be in 30 minutes based on observed movement patterns. German commanders reported to Army Group B headquarters that American artillery seemed to predict their movements. They adjusted, moving at different times, using different routes. American photo reconnaissance documented the changes. Artillery adjusted accordingly. The psychological impact was immediate. German after-action reports from those first days repeatedly used the word uncanny. American fire seemed to anticipate every movement. Units that repositioned at night found themselves under artillery fire at their new locations within hours. Supply columns that changed routes discovered American fighter bombers waiting at alternate crossroads. It wasn't intelligence superiority. It was systematic observation, creating predictive patterns. Colonel Edwin Luther, commanding artillery for 7th Corps, had developed the time-on-target method to devastating perfection. When American observers identified a worthwhile target, Luther's system coordinated multiple artillery battalions firing from different locations, timing shells to impact simultaneously. A German position might see a single ranging shot, calculate they had minutes before the main bombardment, and attempt to displace, only to have dozens of shells from 6 different directions arrive within a 5-second window. The scale of American artillery was something German veterans couldn't process. The 3rd Armored Division alone had dedicated artillery support equivalent to what the entire Wehrmacht army in the pocket could deploy. When 7th Corps called for corps-level artillery support, over 300 guns could fire coordinated missions. The Ruhr pocket contained approximately 800 German artillery pieces, but inadequate ammunition and constant counter-battery fire meant fewer than 200 could fire at any given time. But artillery was merely the anvil. The hammer was operational tempo. American armored columns didn't attack German positions. They bypassed them. Using radio communications and aerial reconnaissance, American commanders identified gaps in German lines within hours of their formation. Tank columns would exploit these gaps before German reserves could respond, cutting off entire units from supply and communication. The 2nd Armored Division demonstrated this on April 7th. Reconnaissance identified a 4-kilometer gap in German lines, southeast of Hamm. Within 3 hours, Combat Command A had pushed an entire armored column through the gap, advanced 15 kilometers, and blocked the main supply route for 2 German divisions. The encircled German forces discovered they were cut off only when supply convoys failed to arrive. By then, American forces had established blocking positions too strong to break without a major counterattack and attacked German forces no longer had the fuel or coordination to mount. What made this psychologically devastating wasn't just the encirclement, it was the timing. German tactical doctrine emphasized rapid response to developing situations, but American operational tempo moved faster than German decision cycles. By the time German commanders identified a problem, communicated orders, and began executing responses, American forces had already advanced to the next phase. Lieutenant Karl Guderian, operations officer for the 116th Panzer Division, wrote in his journal on April 9th, "We are always responding to situations that have already changed. Our commanders make correct decisions for circumstances that no longer exist. By the time orders reach forward units, the Americans have moved and the orders are obsolete. We are fighting yesterday's battle while they are already positioning for tomorrow's." The system wasn't perfect. American units still faced fierce resistance at key points, still took casualties, still encountered situations where German tactical skill created local advantages. But those tactical victories meant nothing within the larger operational framework. A German company might successfully defend a crossroads for 6 hours, inflicting casualties on American attacking units, only to discover American forces had already bypassed the position entirely and cut off their withdrawal route. April 12, 1945. The cascade began in earnest. What started as tactical defeats transformed into systemic collapse within the German command structure. The breaking point wasn't any single engagement. It was the cumulative realization that continued resistance served no purpose. American intelligence teams working with captured German communications equipment documented the collapse in real time. Radio intercepts from German divisional headquarters revealed a pattern. Initial confidence, followed by confusion, then desperation, finally resignation. By April 14th, entire battalions were surrendering without American forces even approaching their positions. They simply walked out of their fortifications and waited for Americans to process them. The 9th Panzer Division provides the clearest example. On April 10th, the division reported full combat readiness with 47 operational tanks and 4,200 combat effectives. Division Commander General Harold von Elverfeldt issued orders for aggressive counterattacks to restore German lines. On April 13th, after 3 days of attempting to execute offensive operations, von Elverfeldt reported to Army Group B, "Every movement draws immediate artillery fire. Every concentration draws air attack. We advance 500 meters. American armor appears on our flanks. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place or surrender." On April 15th, von Elverfeldt surrendered his division with 38 tanks still operational and ammunition for 2 more days of combat. When interrogated by American intelligence officers, he stated, "I surrendered not because we were defeated, but because fighting had become murder. I could achieve nothing except the death of my men." The psychological studies conducted by US Army psychiatrists with surrendered German troops revealed common themes. Soldiers described a sense of helplessness, unlike anything experienced on the Eastern Front. Against the Soviets, individual courage and tactical skill could change local situations. Against the Americans, nothing they did mattered, one German sergeant told interrogators. Against the Russians, a brave man might survive. Against the Americans, bravery just meant you died for nothing. The industrial dimension of American warfare manifested in ways German soldiers found incomprehensible. American units that suffered casualties received replacements within days. Equipment losses were replaced overnight. Ammunition expenditure that would have crippled a German division for weeks was considered routine by American standards. The 3rd Armored Division fired more artillery shells on April 13th than the entire German pocket fired during the entire week. But the most psychologically devastating aspect wasn't material superiority. It was the methodical inevitability. American forces advanced on predictable schedules. They moved forward exactly as far as their supply lines would support, then paused to consolidate. They didn't rush, didn't take unnecessary risks, didn't provide opportunities for German counterattacks. They simply ground forward like a machine, impersonal and unstoppable. German soldiers began calling it Walzenkrieg, steamroller war. There was no glory in it, no opportunity for heroism, no way for courage or skill to matter. You couldn't ambush a steamroller. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only wait for it to reach you and then be crushed or step aside. By April 16th, American forces had processed over 150,000 prisoners. The supply infrastructure for handling surrenders became as sophisticated as combat operations. Prisoner processing stations operated on assembly line principles. German soldiers were disarmed, documented, given food and water, and moved to rear areas within hours. The efficiency itself was demoralizing. Americans handled the surrender of entire divisions with the same systematic efficiency they applied to combat. Field marshal models, headquarters maintained communication until April 17th. His final operational orders revealed a commander who understood the situation completely but couldn't bring himself to accept it. He authorized unit commanders to surrender if they judged continued resistance pointless, effectively dissolving his command while refusing to formally capitulate himself. On April 21st, the last organized German resistance in the pocket ceased. Final prisoner counts exceeded 325,000, the largest mass surrender in Western Front history. American casualties during the entire operation: 10,000 wounded, 2,000 killed. German casualties: approximately 10,000 killed in combat, the rest captured. The casualty ratio, normally favoring defenders in prepared positions, had been completely inverted. At 4 o'clock, American artillery began firing on roads and intersections, not where German troops were, but where they would be in 30 minutes based on observed movement patterns. German commanders reported to Army Group B headquarters that American artillery seemed to predict their movements. They adjusted, moving at different times, using different routes. American photo reconnaissance documented the changes. Artillery adjusted accordingly. The coordination required for this predictive bombardment involved a network of forward observers positioned on every commanding height within the pocket's perimeter. These observers, equipped with updated topographical maps marked in precise grid coordinates, communicated constantly with fire direction centers established at battalion level. Each FDC maintained plotting boards where trained personnel tracked German movement patterns across multiple days, identifying not just current positions, but behavioral tendencies. When a German supply convoy altered its route from the main highway to secondary roads, American observers noted not just the change, but the timing, the spacing between vehicles, the tendency to halt in wooded areas during daylight hours. This accumulated data fed into firing tables that predicted not where Germans were, but where German doctrine and habit would compel them to be. The psychological impact was immediate. German after-action reports from those first days repeatedly used the word uncanny. American fire seemed to anticipate every movement. Units that repositioned at night found themselves under artillery fire at their new locations within hours. Supply columns that changed routes discovered American fighter bombers waiting at alternate crossroads. It wasn't intelligence superiority, it was systematic observation creating predictive patterns. Major Heinrich Volkmann, operations officer for the 116th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, recorded in his personal diary on April 8th. We moved the battalion headquarters at 300 hours, believing darkness would conceal our displacement. By 0430, while we were still establishing communications in the new command post, American shells began falling on the crossroads 200 meters from our position. They were not ranging shots. They were precise, timed salvos clearly intended for that exact location. How did they know we would position ourselves near that intersection? How did they calculate our movement time so exactly that their shells arrived just as we were most vulnerable? The answer lay in American observation aircraft that flew continuous patterns throughout each day and night. L-4 Grasshopper spotter planes, slow and seemingly vulnerable, maintained constant surveillance at altitudes where German anti-aircraft fire was ineffective. At night, these were supplemented by specially equipped night reconnaissance aircraft using flares and early infrared detection equipment. Every movement of German forces larger than a squad was observed, plotted, and analyzed for patterns. German commanders attempted to randomize their movements, but randomization itself created patterns. Units that moved at irregular intervals still had to arrive at destinations dictated by geography. There were only so many roads, only so many positions with adequate cover and fields of fire. American observers didn't need to know which route Germans would choose. They only needed to identify the limited set of possibilities and prepare fire missions for all of them. Colonel Edwin Luther, commanding artillery for 7th Corps, had developed the time-on-target method to devastating perfection. When American observers identified a worthwhile target, Luther's system coordinated multiple artillery battalions firing from different locations, timing shells to impact simultaneously. A German position might see a single ranging shot. Calculate they had minutes before the main bombardment and attempt to displace, only to have dozens of shells from 6 different directions arrive within a 5-second window. The mathematics of time-on-target fire were elegant in their brutality. Each participating battery calculated the time of flight for their shells to reach the target. A battery positioned 8 kilometers from the target with a flight time of 23 seconds would fire 23 seconds after a battery positioned 12 kilometers away with a flight time of 46 seconds. All shells, regardless of origin, converged on the target simultaneously. German defensive doctrine assumed that after an initial ranging shot, units would have between 2 and 4 minutes to seek cover or displace before the main bombardment. Time on target eliminated that window entirely. The first shell to arrive was part of a devastating barrage of dozens or hundreds more. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, commanding a company of the 190th Infantry Division, described the experience in his post-war memoir. We heard a single shell pass overhead and impact 300 meters beyond our position. Standard ranging procedure. I ordered the company to prepare to displace. We had done this dozens of times in Russia. You hear the ranging shot, you estimate 2 minutes until the main barrage. You move to alternate positions. But there was no 2 minutes. Before I could finish giving the order, the world exploded. Shells came from every direction simultaneously. Men died before they could take a single step. The entire barrage lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When it ended, 40% of my company was dead or wounded, and we had accomplished nothing except to wait for death to find us. The scale of American artillery was something German veterans couldn't process. The 3rd Armored Division alone had dedicated artillery support equivalent to what the entire Wehrmacht army in the pocket could deploy. When 7th Corps called for corps-level artillery support, over 300 guns could fire coordinated missions. The Ruhr pocket contained approximately 800 German artillery pieces, but inadequate ammunition and constant counter-battery fire meant fewer than 200 could fire at any given time. American counter-battery fire operated with precision that German artillerists found terrifying. Every German gun that fired was located within minutes through sound and flash ranging, supplemented by radar detection equipment that tracked the trajectory of shells in flight. Once located, German batteries received immediate counter-battery fire from multiple American battalions. The standard American doctrine allocated 3 American guns for every identified German gun, firing 3 rounds for every 1 German round. German artillery units found that firing more than 6 shells before displacing resulted in devastating counter-battery strikes. This constant displacement meant German artillery never achieved the registration and accuracy that sustained bombardment required. Captain Joseph Brandt, battery commander in the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division's artillery regiment, recorded in an April 11th letter to his wife, never sent, found in his effects after his capture. "We have become gypsies with guns. We move into position, fire 3 or 4 shells, and immediately displace before American counter-battery fire arrives. But this constant movement means we never achieve proper registration. Our fire is inaccurate, wasted. We shoot to avoid being shot at, not to achieve any military objective. The Americans, meanwhile, fire from permanent positions with perfect registration. Each of their shells lands exactly where intended. Our ammunition dwindles while accomplishing nothing, but artillery was merely the anvil. The hammer was operational tempo. American armored columns didn't attack German positions. They bypassed them. Using radio communications and aerial reconnaissance, American commanders identified gaps in German lines within hours of their formation. Tank columns would exploit these gaps before German reserves could respond, cutting off entire units from supply and communication. The 2nd Armored Division demonstrated this on April 7th. Reconnaissance identified a 4-kilometer gap in German lines, southeast of Hamm. Within 3 hours, Combat Command A had pushed an entire armored column through the gap, advanced 15 kilometers, and blocked the main supply route for 2 German divisions. The encircled German forces discovered they were cut off only when supply convoys failed to arrive. By then, American forces had established blocking positions too strong to break without a major counterattack, an attack German forces no longer had the fuel or coordination to mount. The operational details of this maneuver reveal American advantages in communications and coordination. At 0630 hours, an L-4 spotter plane identified the gap and radioed coordinates to 2nd Armored Division headquarters. By 0645, Division Commander Major General Ernest Harmon had reviewed aerial photographs rushed from the previous day's reconnaissance sortie, confirmed the gap was substantial enough for exploitation, and issued warning orders to Combat Command A by 0720. Combat Command A's commander, Brigadier General Sidney Hines, had assembled his staff, reviewed the plan, and issued detailed movement orders to subordinate battalions. By 0800, lead tanks were already moving toward the gap. This decision cycle, from initial observation to forces in motion, took 90 minutes. German operational tempo under optimal conditions required 4 to 6 hours for equivalent decisions. But conditions in the Ruhr pocket were far from optimal. German communications relied primarily on telephone lines that American artillery deliberately targeted, and motorcycle couriers who had to navigate roads under constant air attack. The same decision cycle that took Americans 90 minutes required Germans 8 to 12 hours when communications functioned at all, days when they didn't. By the time German commanders identified that Combat Command A had penetrated their lines, American forces had already advanced to positions where they couldn't be dislodged without major offensive operations. German doctrine emphasized elastic defense, allowing penetrations, then counterattacking to cut off and destroy penetrating forces. But this doctrine assumed defenders possessed mobility and communications to coordinate counterattacks. In the Ruhr pocket, German units lacked the fuel for sustained movement and the communications to coordinate multi-unit operations. By the time a German counterattack could be organized and launched, American forces had already consolidated positions, brought up anti-tank guns, registered artillery, and prepared for exactly the counterattack German doctrine dictated they would attempt. What made this psychologically devastating wasn't just the encirclement, it was the timing. German tactical doctrine emphasized rapid response to developing situations, but American operational tempo moved faster than German decision cycles. By the time German commanders identified a problem, communicated orders, and began executing responses, American forces had already advanced to the next phase. Lieutenant Karl Guderian, operations officer for the 116th Panzer Division, wrote in his journal on April 9th, "We are always responding to situations that have already changed. Our commanders make correct decisions for circumstances that no longer exist. By the time orders reach forward units, the Americans have moved and the orders are obsolete. We are fighting yesterday's battle while they are already positioning for tomorrow's." This temporal dislocation created a cascading psychological effect throughout German command structures. Junior officers began to distrust orders from higher headquarters, knowing that by the time orders arrived, the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. Senior commanders, receiving reports hours or days after events occurred, made decisions based on information they knew was outdated but had no better alternative. The entire command structure began operating in a fog of uncertainty, where even accurate information lost value through delay. Captain Heinz Dietrich, company commander in the 89th Infantry Division, recorded in testimony to American interrogators, "On April 10th, I received orders to advance north and establish contact with the 190th Infantry Division, which division headquarters believed was holding positions 5 kilometers from our location. I knew these orders were at least 8 hours old. The courier who delivered them told me he'd been traveling since before dawn. I also knew that American forces had been active in the area between our position and the 190th's last known location. But orders are orders. We advanced. The 190th was not where headquarters believed them to be. They had withdrawn or been destroyed days before. We walked directly into an American blocking position and lost half the company in the first 5 minutes. The orders were correct when issued, but meaningless when executed. The system wasn't perfect. American units still faced fierce resistance at key points, still took casualties, still encountered situations where German tactical skill created local advantages. But those tactical victories meant nothing within the larger operational framework. A German company might successfully defend a crossroads for 6 hours, inflicting casualties on American attacking units, only to discover American forces had already bypassed the position entirely and cut off their withdrawal route. On April 8th, a single German company from the 116th Panzer Division held a critical crossroads northwest of Dortmund against repeated American attacks. The position commanded a major intersection where American forces sought to advance. German defenders, entrenched in building ruins with excellent fields of fire, repulsed 3 American assaults over 6 hours, destroying 4 American tanks and inflicting approximately 30 casualties on attacking infantry. The company commander, Captain Friedrich Schulz reported his successful defense to battalion headquarters, requesting permission to hold the position through the night. Battalion granted permission. Schulz positioned his remaining troops, 57 men with adequate ammunition, to continue the defense. At dawn on April the 9th, Schulz discovered that during the night, American forces had advanced along a parallel road 2 kilometers to the east, completely bypassing his position. The crossroads he had defended so successfully was now 3 kilometers behind American lines. Schulz's company was isolated, surrounded, and of no strategic value. The Americans didn't even bother to attack his position a second time. They simply posted a platoon to contain it, while main forces continued their advance. Schulz surrendered at 1100 hours on April 9th. His successful defense had been tactically brilliant and strategically meaningless. This pattern repeated throughout the pocket. German tactical skill, which had served well in previous campaigns, became irrelevant against an opponent who simply refused to fight where Germans were strong and instead attacked where Germans were weak or absent entirely. The frustration among German combat units became palpable in reports and personal correspondence. Soldiers trained to win battles discovered that winning battles achieved nothing. April 12, 1945. The cascade began in earnest. What started as tactical defeats transformed into systemic collapse within the German command structure. The breaking point wasn't any single engagement. It was the cumulative realization that continued resistance served no purpose. American intelligence teams, working with captured German communications equipment, documented the collapse in real time. Radio intercepts from German divisional headquarters revealed a pattern: initial confidence, followed by confusion, then desperation, finally resignation. By April 14th, entire battalions were surrendering without American forces even approaching their positions. They simply walked out of their fortifications and waited for Americans to process them. The signals intelligence operation that monitored German communications operated from a converted schoolhouse in Wesel, where teams of German-speaking American signals specialists and anti-Nazi German émigrés worked 24-hour shifts monitoring radio traffic. The equipment, SCR-299 radio sets modified for increased sensitivity, could intercept German communications across most of the pocket. Because German forces within the pocket were isolated from external support, their radio discipline deteriorated rapidly. Units that might have maintained communication security under normal circumstances began broadcasting in clear language when landlines were cut and they had no alternatives. The intercepts revealed the psychological deterioration in precise detail. On April 12th, the 338th Infantry Division headquarters radioed to Army Group B. Division has adequate ammunition and defensive positions are strong. We can hold our sector indefinitely if supply lines remain open. By April 13th, the same division headquarters. American forces have penetrated along our southern boundary. We are attempting to re-establish defensive line. Request permission to withdraw to secondary positions. By April 14th, division is encircled, attempting breakout to the north. Heavy casualties. Many units out of contact. By April 15th, request instructions. Continued resistance achieves nothing. Recommend authorization to surrender with honor. This progression played out across multiple divisions simultaneously. American intelligence officers tracking these intercepts could predict with reasonable accuracy when specific units would collapse based on the evolution of their radio traffic. Units progress through identifiable stages: denial of the situation's severity, attempts to fulfill orders despite impossible circumstances, recognition that orders couldn't be fulfilled, requests for new orders that never arrived or arrived too late to matter, finally requests for permission to surrender. On April 21st, the last organized German resistance in the pocket ceased. Final prisoner counts exceeded 325,000, the largest mass surrender in Western Front history. American casualties during the entire operation: 10,000 wounded, 2,000 killed. German casualties: approximately 10,000 killed in combat, the rest captured. The casualty ratio, normally favoring defenders in prepared positions, had been completely inverted. The after-action reports filed by American units provide additional detail on the operation's final days. Between April 16th and April 21st, organized German resistance fragmented into isolated pockets, each collapsing independently as ammunition ran out or when American forces finally closed on their positions. Some units fought to the end, The 116th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion held a position near Iserlohn until April 19th, surrendering only after expending all ammunition. Other units surrendered en masse when they realized continued fighting served no purpose. The logistical challenge of processing over 300,000 prisoners taxed even American organizational capability. Temporary POW camps established throughout the region overflowed with prisoners faster than transportation could move them to permanent facilities. In some cases, German prisoners significantly outnumbered their American guards. At one processing station near Soest, approximately 12,000 German prisoners were guarded by fewer than 300 American military police. The prisoners, exhausted and demoralized, made no attempt to resist or escape. Most seemed relieved that fighting had ended and they had survived. The intelligence gathered from these prisoners provided extensive information about German military capabilities, morale, and the effectiveness of American operations. This information informed American planning for subsequent operations and contributed to assessments that German military collapse was inevitable, given Allied material superiority and operational advantages. The Ruhr pocket's liquidation represented the culmination of advantages the Americans had been building throughout the campaign in Western Europe: air superiority, artillery dominance, logistical sustainability, communications superiority, and operational tempo that exceeded German capacity to respond. None of these advantages was individually decisive. Together, they created a form of warfare that German forces, trained and experienced in different operational contexts, could not effectively counter. The result was not just tactical defeat, but psychological collapse. German soldiers lost confidence that their skills, courage, or sacrifice could achieve anything meaningful, and that loss of confidence made continued resistance unbearable, regardless of remaining material capability to fight.